A solitary rancher rescues a widow and her children from a blizzard. Together they find shelter and love. Welcome to today's story, set in the harsh winters of the American Old West, where survival depended on courage, kindness, and the strength to help strangers in need. You're about to witness how a chance encounter during a deadly blizzard changes the lives of a lonely rancher and a desperate family forever. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel. The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal across the endless white expanse, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone caught unprepared. It was December 1887, and this was shaping up to be one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. The snow fell so thick that a man couldn't see his own horse's ears, and the temperature had dropped so low that breath froze before it left your lips. Thomas McKenna pulled his wool coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his sturdy bay mare, Belle, through the drifting snow toward his ranch. At 34, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade building his cattle operation from nothing, working land that most folks said was too harsh and isolated for civilized living. But Thomas preferred the solitude. After losing his parents to cholera and watching his younger brother die at Gettysburg, he'd found peace in the vast emptiness of the frontier. His ranch sat in a valley protected by rolling hills, with a modest but well-built cabin, a sturdy barn, and grazing land that stretched as far as the eye could see. In summer, it was beautiful. In winter, it was merely survival. As Belle struggled through a particularly deep drift, Thomas heard something that made him pull up short. Through the howling wind came a sound that didn't belong in this frozen wasteland, the crying of a child. Thomas strained his ears, wondering if the storm was playing tricks on him, but there it was again, faint but unmistakable. He urged Belle forward, following the sound until he could make out shapes in the swirling snow. A broken-down wagon, its wheels sunk deep in a drift, and huddled against its side, 3 small figures. "Hello there," Thomas called out, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Are you hurt?" A woman's voice answered, weak but determined. "Please, my children, they're so cold." Thomas dismounted and pushed through the snow toward them. What he found made his heart clench with both pity and admiration. A young woman, probably no more than 25, sat with her back against the wagon wheel, her arms wrapped around 2 small children. A boy who couldn't be more than 8, and a girl who looked about 5. All 3 were blue with cold, their lips nearly purple, but the woman's eyes blazed with a fierce, protective love that reminded Thomas of a she-wolf defending her cubs. "Mom, I'm Thomas McKenna. I have a ranch not far from here. We need to get you and your children warm, or..." He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what would happen if they stayed out here much longer. "I'm Mary Henderson," the woman said through chattering teeth. "This is my son James and my daughter Lucy. Our horse..." The storm spooked him. He broke free and ran off with most of our supplies. Thomas looked at the wagon. It was clear this family had been traveling with everything they owned: furniture, trunks, farm tools, all now buried under snow. They were homesteaders, probably heading west for a new start, and the storm had caught them completely off guard. "Can you ride?" Thomas asked Mary. She nodded, though he could see it was taking all her strength just to stay upright. Without another word, Thomas began organizing their rescue. He helped James and Lucy onto Belle first, wrapping them in his heavy coat. The children were small enough to fit together in the saddle. Mary he helped up behind them, though she protested weakly that she could walk. "No, ma'am," Thomas said firmly, taking Belle's reins to lead her through the snow. "That's not happening, not in this storm." The journey to his ranch was the longest 2 miles of Thomas's life. With every step, he could feel the storm getting worse, the wind cutting through his clothes like knives. Behind him, he could hear Mary murmuring to her children, keeping them awake and alert. Her voice was getting weaker, but she never stopped encouraging them, telling them stories about the warm place they were going, promising them hot soup and a soft bed. When Thomas's cabin finally came into view through the blowing snow, he felt a relief so profound it nearly knocked him over. The sight of the sturdy log walls and the thin stream of smoke still rising from the chimney looked like heaven itself. If you're enjoying the video so far, a like and subscribe to the channel really helps a lot. He got them inside quickly, his practiced hands building up the fire, while Mary collapsed into a chair, still holding Lucy while James stood close by, all of them shivering uncontrollably. The cabin, which had seemed so empty and quiet just hours before, suddenly felt alive with the presence of these three souls who had almost been lost to the storm. Thomas worked with quiet efficiency, hanging wet clothes near the fire, wrapping the children in warm blankets, and putting a pot of coffee on to boil. Mary watched him with exhausted gratitude, too tired to protest his kindness. "Thank you," she whispered as he handed her a cup of hot coffee. I thought we were going to die out there." Thomas met her eyes and saw something there that stirred feelings he'd thought long buried: courage, strength, and a kind of beauty that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with the fierce love of a mother for her children. "You're safe now," he said simply. "All of you." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Thomas's cabin, three strangers had found sanctuary. None of them could have known that this night would change all their lives forever. Morning came grey and muffled, the world outside transformed into an unrecognizable landscape of white dunes and ice-covered trees. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of the usual silence that greeted his mornings, he heard the soft sounds of family life, whispered conversations, a child's cough, the rustle of blankets. Mary and her children had slept on his bed, while he'd made do with blankets near the fire. It wasn't the first time he'd given up his bed for travelers. Frontier hospitality demanded no less. But it was the first time he'd found himself lying awake, listening to the sound of another person's breathing, feeling something he couldn't quite name stirring in his chest. He dressed quietly and went outside to check on Belle and his other animals. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world so pristinely white it hurt the eyes. The snow was nearly 4 feet deep in places, and the cold was still bitter enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Travel would be impossible for days, maybe weeks. When he returned to the cabin, Mary was awake, sitting by the fire with Lucy on her lap, while James poked at the coals with a stick. She'd braided her dark brown hair back neatly, and though her dress was simple and travel-worn, there was something elegant about the way she held herself, a dignity that spoke of good breeding despite her obvious poverty. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope we didn't disturb your sleep." "Not at all," Thomas replied, meaning it. "How are you feeling? The children?" "Much better, thanks to you." Mary's voice carried a warmth that made Thomas's chest tighten. "James has been asking about your cattle. He's very interested in ranching." James looked up from the fire, his young face bright with curiosity. "Ma says you have 100 head of cattle, Mr. McKenna. Is that really true?" Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "Close to it. Would you like to see them later when it warms up a bit?" The boy's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Could I really?" "James," Mary said gently, "Mr. McKenna has been kind enough to shelter us. We shouldn't impose further." Thomas found himself speaking before he'd really thought about it. "It's no imposition, and the truth is, with this storm, you'll be staying here for a while whether we like it or not. The roads won't be passable for at least a week, maybe more." He saw a flicker of worry cross Mary's face. "We can't possibly." "You can, and you will," Thomas said firmly. "It's either that, or I dig you out of a snowbank come spring. Besides," he added, his voice softening, "I could use the company." It was an admission that surprised him with its honesty. For years, he'd convinced himself that he preferred solitude, that the quiet was peaceful rather than lonely. But having voices in his cabin, hearing Lucy's giggle when James told her a silly joke, watching Mary's gentle smile as she tended to her children, it made him realize how empty his life had become. As the days passed, they fell into a natural rhythm. Thomas would rise early to tend to the animals and check his fences, work made more difficult by the deep snow, but necessary nonetheless. Mary, despite his protests that she was a guest, insisted on helping around the cabin. She cooked meals that were better than anything Thomas had tasted in years, mended his worn clothes with skilled fingers, and brought a warmth to the space that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. James proved to be an eager student of ranch life. Despite the cold, he followed Thomas everywhere, asking endless questions about cattle, horses, and farming. The boy was smart and quick to learn, and Thomas found himself explaining things he'd never had to put into words before. How to read the weather in the behavior of animals, how to judge the quality of hay, how to spot signs of illness in livestock. Lucy, though quieter than her brother, had her own way of melting Thomas's carefully constructed barriers. She would sit by his feet while he worked on tack repair or carved new fence posts, chattering about everything and nothing in the way of small children. Sometimes she would fall asleep there, and Thomas would find himself sitting perfectly still, not wanting to disturb her peaceful slumber. But it was Mary who truly changed everything. In quiet moments when the children were playing or sleeping, they would talk. Thomas learned that she'd been widowed 6 months earlier when her husband died in a mining accident in Colorado. They'd been traveling to Oregon, where Mary's sister lived, hoping to start over. Mary learned that Thomas had built his ranch with his own hands, that he'd never married because the right woman had never come along, and that beneath his gruff exterior was a man who'd simply forgotten how to let people close. Leave a comment about what you think of this story so far. One evening, as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed, Mary looked at Thomas with those expressive eyes of hers and said something that would stay with him forever. "You know, Thomas, I think God sent that storm for a reason." Thomas, who'd had a complicated relationship with faith since the war, looked at her skeptically. "To nearly freeze you and your children to death?" Mary smiled, an expression so gentle and knowing it took his breath away. "To bring us to exactly where we needed to be." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them all of how harsh the world could be. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the soft glow of firelight and the presence of people who were becoming more than just temporary guests, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The third week brought a brief warming spell that melted the top layer of snow into slush, followed by a hard freeze that turned everything into treacherous ice. Thomas knew from experience that travel would remain impossible for at least another week, but he could see that Mary was growing restless, worried about being a burden, despite his repeated assurances to the contrary. It was during this time that their temporary arrangement faced its first real test. Thomas had been out checking on a section of fence that he worried might have been damaged by the weight of snow when he heard Belle whinnying in distress from the barn. He hurried back to find Mary standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry, while James knelt beside one of Thomas's milk cows that had somehow gotten loose and was now lying on her side in obvious distress. "She was making awful sounds," Mary said quickly as Thomas approached. "James went to see what was wrong, and she just collapsed." Thomas knelt beside the cow, Bessie, one of his best milkers, and quickly assessed the situation. Her breathing was labored, her eyes rolled back, and her belly was distended in a way that made his heart sink. He'd seen this before: bloat caused by eating too much rich feed too quickly. If not treated immediately, she would die. "James, I need you to run to the cabin and bring me the sharpest knife you can find," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Mary, I need you to help me hold her steady." Mary didn't hesitate, moving to help restrain the struggling animal, despite her long skirts and obvious inexperience with cattle. James returned quickly with the knife, his young face tight with concern. What happened next tested all of them in ways none had expected. Thomas had to perform an emergency procedure to relieve the gas buildup in Bessie's stomach, a process that was both gruesome and delicate. Mary never flinched, holding the cow's head steady and speaking to her in soothing tones while Thomas worked. James, though clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing, stayed close and handed Thomas whatever he needed without being asked. It took nearly an hour, but eventually Bessie's breathing eased and she was able to struggle to her feet. Thomas sat back on his heels, exhausted and covered in sweat despite the cold, and looked at Mary and James with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you," he said simply. "Both of you. I couldn't have saved her without your help." Mary's response surprised him. Instead of the modest deflection he expected, she met his eyes directly and said, "We're a team now, aren't we? Teams help each other." Lee, that evening, after they'd cleaned up and shared a quiet dinner, Thomas found himself really looking at Mary for the first time. Not as a woman he'd rescued, not as a temporary guest, but as someone who might belong in his life permanently. She'd proven herself that day in ways that went beyond mere gratitude or politeness. She'd shown courage, competence, and a willingness to do what needed doing without complaint. But it was James who brought the situation to a head. As Thomas was banking the fire for the night, the boy approached him with the serious expression that children sometimes wore when they were about to say something important. "Mr. McKenna, can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. Are you going to marry my ma?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He glanced toward Mary, who was putting Lucy to bed, and pretended not to have heard, though the slight stiffening of her shoulders suggested otherwise. That's a very direct question, James," Thomas said carefully. "Pa always told me to be direct about important things," James replied, "and this seems important. Ma's been happier here than she's been since Pa died, and you've been different too since we got here. Happier, I mean. Out of the mouths of babes." Thomas realized that this 8-year-old boy had seen something that he'd been trying not to acknowledge. Somewhere between that first night of rescue and this moment, Mary Henderson and her children had stopped being guests and started being family. If you've been enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really makes a difference. "Your mother and I haven't discussed such things," Thomas said finally. "But you want to, don't you?" James pressed. "I see how you look at her, and how she looks at you when she thinks nobody's watching." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Mary found themselves alone by the dying fire. The conversation that followed was halting and awkward at first, filled with all the uncertainty of two people who'd found themselves in an unexpected situation. "James spoke to you earlier," Mary said finally, not quite meeting his eyes. "He did. Children see things clearly sometimes, too clearly." Thomas moved closer to her on the rough wooden bench they shared. "And what do you see, Mary?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the glowing coals. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I see a good man who's been alone too long. I see someone who's been kind to my children, who's treated us like family instead of charity cases. I see," she paused, finally looking at him, "I see someone I could love if I let myself." The honesty in her words took Thomas's breath away. "And what's stopping you?" "Fear," she admitted. "Fear that this is just gratitude or loneliness or desperation. Fear that when spring comes and we could leave, you'll realize you want your solitude back. Fear that I'm reading more into your kindness than is really there." Thomas reached out and gently took her hand. It was work-roughened but soft, warm despite the cool air. "Mary, I built this ranch with the idea that someday I'd have a family to share it with. I never expected it to happen like this." "You mean stranded by a blizzard with a widow and her children?" "I mean falling in love with a woman who's brave enough to help save a dying cow, strong enough to keep her children's spirits up in the worst storm I've seen in years, and beautiful enough to make me forget that I ever thought I wanted to be alone." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but they were the good kind, the kind that came with relief and joy, and the sudden lifting of burdens too long carried alone. "Thomas," she whispered, and in that single word was all the answer he needed. When they kissed, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty, it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. Outside, the wind continued to blow, but inside, two hearts that had been broken by loss and loneliness began to heal together. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it finally arrived, it did so with a rush of melting snow, budding trees and wildflowers that painted the valley in brilliant splashes of color. Thomas had never paid much attention to the beauty of spring before, but seeing it through Mary's eyes and watching James and Lucy discover the wonders of ranch life in good weather made him appreciate his land in entirely new ways. The past month had been filled with practical preparations and deeper conversations. Thomas and Mary had talked honestly about their fears, their hopes, and what a future together might look like. They'd discussed everything from finances to child rearing, from the challenges of ranch life to Mary's concerns about being accepted in the small community that lay 20 miles south. James had taken to ranch work like he was born to it, eagerly learning to milk cows, mend fences, and even help with the spring carving. Lucy had appointed herself chief egg collector and had somehow managed to befriend every chicken on the place, giving them all names and treating them like pets rather than livestock. It was on a particularly beautiful April morning, with the last of the snow finally melted and the grass beginning to show green, that Thomas made his formal proposal. He'd been planning it for weeks, but in the end, it happened spontaneously in the most ordinary of circumstances. Mary was hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between two posts, humming softly to herself while Lucy played nearby with a doll Thomas had carved for her. The morning sun caught the highlights in Mary's hair, and her simple blue dress fluttered in the gentle breeze. She looked so perfectly right there, so much like she belonged, that Thomas found himself walking over without conscious thought. "Mary," he said, and something in his tone made her stop what she was doing and turn to face him. "Yes? I know we've talked about this, about us, about the future, but I need to ask you properly." He took her hands in his, noting that they were no longer quite so soft, marked now with the small calluses that came from honest work. "Mary Henderson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The smile that lit up her face was brighter than the spring sunshine. "Thomas McKenna, nothing would make me happier." They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in town, with most of the community in attendance. Thomas had worried about how Mary and the children would be received, but his concerns proved groundless. The people of their small town understood the realities of frontier life, that good people were precious, regardless of how they came to be there, and that love found in hardship was often the strongest kind. James insisted on standing up with Thomas as his best man, a responsibility he took with endearing seriousness. Lucy served as Mary's flower girl, scattering wildflowers she'd picked herself down the church aisle. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas felt a completion he'd never known he was missing. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and music and staying well into the evening. As Thomas watched Mary laugh with the other women, saw James showing off his rope tricks to some of the local boys, and observed Lucy charming every adult within reach, he marveled at how completely his life had changed. Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, approached him as the evening was winding down. "You're a lucky man, Thomas McKenna," she said with a knowing smile. "Yes, ma'am, I am. That storm last winter, worst I've seen in 40 years of living here, could have been a tragedy." Thomas looked across the yard to where Mary was helping Lucy practice a folk dance with some of the other children. "Instead, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. As summer settled over the ranch, the new family found their rhythm. Thomas expanded his operation, buying more cattle and planning improvements to the house. Mary started a garden that quickly became the envy of every ranch wife in the territory. James convinced Thomas to let him have his own small herd of calves to raise, and Lucy appointed herself supervisor of all chickens, cats, and any other small animals that wandered onto the property. But perhaps the most profound change was in Thomas himself. The man who had convinced himself that solitude was strength now understood that true strength came from having people to care for, to protect, to love. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed empty on the rare occasions when his family was away visiting town. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Mary rested her head on Thomas's shoulder and said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never met? If that storm hadn't come?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think I'd have lived my whole life without really understanding what living meant." James, who'd been practicing his lasso work in the yard, came over and plopped down on the porch steps. "Pa always said everything happens for a reason," he said, using the title he'd naturally started applying to Thomas after the wedding. "Smart man, your father," Thomas replied, and meant it. The ghost of Mary's first husband had been a presence they'd had to navigate carefully. But time and honest conversation had helped them all understand that loving someone new didn't diminish the love that had come before. Lucy, tired from a day of adventure, climbed into Mary's lap and yawned. "Tell us a story, Ma." "What kind of story?" Mary asked, stroking her daughter's hair. "A true one," Lucy said sleepily. "About how we came to live here." Mary looked at Thomas, and he saw the same wonder in her eyes that he felt in his heart. "Well," she began, "it all started with the worst storm anyone could remember, and the bravest, kindest man in all of Wyoming." As Mary's voice carried on the evening air, telling their story to their children, Thomas felt a contentment so deep it seemed to reach his very soul. The wind that had once brought only loneliness now carried the sounds of family, laughter, conversation, the simple pleasure of people who belonged together. The storm that had nearly taken everything from them had instead given them everything they'd never dared to hope for. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas McKenna knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the people he was meant to love. What did you think of Thomas and Mary's journey from strangers to family? Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the most unexpected circumstances. If you enjoyed this tale of finding love and family in the harsh but beautiful American frontier, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering your questions. Which part touched your heart the most? Was it their first meeting in the storm, the growing trust as they worked together, or perhaps the way the children brought them together? Share your favorite moment in the comments below and let's discuss this heartwarming story. If you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected storms.